Are masks a religious symbol? When we wear masks, are we participating in a religious ritual? I want to tell you a little bit about what happened yesterday when I went to class at University of Waterloo. This was the first classes I've had since last week where the University of Waterloo issued an edict requiring that masks be worn by all students and faculty and staff within the instructional space, i.e. the classrooms. As you guys know, I've got some pretty strong feelings about vax mandates in particular, and masking to some degree as well. And I felt that these mandates are unnecessary. And I want to tell you a little bit about what happened when I decided to go into the classroom without wearing a mask. It's not exactly what I expected would happen, frankly, but interesting nonetheless. But before that, just by way of a little bit of context, for those of you who don't know, I'm working toward what's called my MTS, which is a Masters of Theological Studies at a school called Conrad Grebel University College. Now, I just said I went to Waterloo. Well, I do. Conrad Grebel is what they call a university college. That is sort of a separate school or partially separate school from University of Waterloo in general. There's 3 other schools there that I think have similar status, and all 4 of these schools or university colleges have roots in various religious traditions. So I think the fact that Conrad Grebel is arguably a religious school, depending on exactly how you define that, or certainly a school that has roots in a specific religious tradition. And that tradition happens to be the Mennonite and Anabaptist traditions. And I think that's important. I'll explain why in a few minutes. So anyway, as some of you might know, I had to take some time off school because they required proof of vaccine. I wasn't willing to provide that. And more recently, I've gone back to class. And up until yesterday, masks were optional. And I noticed that since September, that some of my classmates wore masks, some of us didn't. And it didn't seem to be a problem to anyone that I noticed. In fact, I noticed some of the same people on a certain day would wear a mask, and then maybe the next week they didn't. I didn't inquire about that, but I suppose for whatever reason people made different decisions. Maybe they were feeling ill one day, or they're going to go visit someone later that they were worried they might infect. I don't know. But the point is there was some diversity of opinions, it seemed, based on people's free actions about whether or not to wear a mask or not. So anyway, last week, the University of Waterloo, so that's separate from Conrad Grebel in this context, they issued this edict that people must wear masks. As far as I know, Conrad Grebel wasn't asked their opinion. I think it was a university-wide mandate that Grebel, I don't think, had any direct say, although I did get the impression from one instructor that Conrad Grebel decided to affirm that course of action. Anyway, so I go to my first class. I get in there a few minutes before the class is to start, and everyone is wearing a mask, and I'm not. The instructor asked, or I think she said, there's some masks over here if you need one, Peter. And I said something along, I can't remember exactly what I said, but the gist was, I prefer not to wear a mask. And then we kind of got talking about why. I gave a bunch of reasons. To this instructor's credit, I'll just call her Instructor A, she did actually seem interested in hearing sort of my objections. Like, we did talk about it for a bit. I can't remember what order I shared them, but I think I said something that I don't believe that the university itself has the legitimate authority to require this of its students. So I deny that it has the authority to make this call. I said something about how it infringes on one's freedom of conscience, one's freedom to sort of decide for oneself about what they believe and what they hold to be true. And I think that's important because I want to touch on more of that later. I also appeal to the school's tradition itself. As I mentioned, Conrad Grebel has its roots in what's known as the Anabaptist and Mennonite traditions. And there's lots that can be said about it, but for the purpose of this discussion, it's important to know that the Anabaptists going back centuries, when their inception shortly after, around the time of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, the Anabaptists held some strong views about one's personal faith. That the state, or even what they call the magisterial church, that is the church that sort of, not to get too much into the weeds, where the church and the state apparatus are similar, or at least connected, that it's not up to those authorities to decide, for example, when one gets baptized. So many of the church traditions of the time, specifically the Lutheran and the Roman Catholic traditions, both did infant baptisms. And the Anabaptists felt it was very important that a baptism occur when one is an adult, or at least at an age where one can make that profession of faith by one's own volition. So that idea of being true to your conscience is something that's been historically important to Anabaptists. There's a lot more that can be said. Many early Anabaptists were martyred because they refused to follow the dictates of various civil or church authorities. So I appeal to the importance of sort of our tradition as Anabaptists for allowing one to exercise one's own conscience. I think I appeal to the University of Waterloo's motto, which is, and my Latin is probably not great here, but Concordia cum veritas, I believe is how one pronounces that. And that translates to in harmony with truth. And I question whether or not these mask mandates are indeed in harmony with truth. Now, there is, I would acknowledge, maybe some evidence out there that masks might help stop the spread of infections, but there's other studies that suggest that they might cause certain harms, including, I read an article recently, actually from the University of Waterloo, about how masks may be contributing to things like social anxiety. And there's other studies that question whether these masks are really of much effectiveness anyway. My point is, it's an open question still. It is not something that that a consensus has been formed. It's very much an open question about the efficacy of wearing masks. I think those are the main things. Oh, I also appeal to their value of diversity. So this is something that a lot of colleges and universities are talking about now, and that is like those different social justice initiatives. I have some misgivings about that whole thing, but putting that aside for the moment, this school says that it values diversity, and I question why do we want diversity in certain categories in terms of ethnicity and religious backgrounds, which, by the way, I believe we should have diversity in those areas, yet we don't seem to be able to tolerate diversity of opinion when it comes to health mandates, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, and just the whole narrative around it. We seem that there is one orthodox way to look at this, and anyone who doesn't hew to that strict orthodoxy is not allowed to participate. Anyway, I might have said more, but that was sort of the gist of my arguments. I did get up to, so it came to the point where the instructor A asked me that, well, if I'm not willing to wear a mask, I'll have to leave the classroom, which I did willingly. I wasn't going to create too much of a fuss. In fact, I did get up to leave, and I can't remember exactly how this went, but I was resigned to leaving, and then she asked me some more questions. So again, to her credit, she legitimately seemed interested in having a dialogue, which I appreciate, and was frankly more than I expected, not because of her personally, but just sort of my experience with these mandates in general. Whether you're talking about government, schools, the fire department, there seems to be a lot of inflexibility about even discussing it. So again, to her credit, she was willing to have a dialogue there. Oh, the other thing I did mention was, I think it's not proper that the university has essentially turned its instructors into health mandate deputies or police. They're instructors because they're good at their job, that they know their research, they know their topic, they know how to facilitate a class, why should they be asked to deal with people like me? I'm sure it was difficult for instructor A. It was difficult for me, to be frank. It's amazing how much social pressure there is to walk into a room, and it wasn't a large room. There was, I don't know, maybe 10 people in that class. To walk into a room where everyone but you is wearing a mask. There's a lot of social pressure there, and I had to sort of gird my loins, as it were, to deal with that. And I'm sure it wasn't comfortable for the instructor to have to deal with, a difficult student like me. And I was doing my best to be firm in my convictions, yet not hostile. Anyway, so I left the classroom, and I sat outside the classroom for the duration of that class. Afterward, I did have some students from that class sort of encourage me and even applaud me for my courage to do that. There's one person in particular that said that, he essentially agreed with my stance, but maybe didn't have the courage or the fortitude. Those were sort of his words, or his whatever he was coming from anyway, to do what I did. So I appreciate that encouragement from him. So then I had lunch, and then it was time for my second class. And frankly, this was kind of difficult for me. It was a difficult day yesterday. It was an enlightening day, but a difficult day. Then it was time for my second class, and I was questioning whether I wanted to even go through this again, or maybe I should just go home or kind of not do anything. But I felt that it's important to take these kinds of stands. I don't want to talk more about why I think that's important, because I've got some new thinking about that. Anyway, so I went into the second class, and the instructor, I'll call her C, so instructor C asked me, sort of as class, like before class began, people were still kind of coming in. She asked me if I would wear a mask, and again, I said I would prefer not to. And she sort of asked me why. So we started to get into a little bit of a discussion. And then she actually, this is the part that surprised me, she actually stopped me, and she's actually watched some of my videos, I think my earlier videos about the fire department. So she has some, and she and I have discussed COVID and mandates and vaccines and stuff. I think we have very different perspectives, but as I'll share in a few minutes, I think we really had a meeting of the minds, let's say. Anyway, more on that in a few minutes. But so she sort of stopped me and said, Peter, I assume you're comfortable with this, but would you be okay having this discussion that we're having right now with the rest of the class once class starts? And I said, yeah, absolutely, I'd be happy to do it. So she kind of put that on pause, and we wait. So I sat there without a mask. Other people shuffled in. And these were small classes, I should say. Like, I think this one maybe had 8 people in it. And that's something that's normative of Conrad Grebel, relatively small classes. Anyway, so we had the discussion. And again, like, even more so than instructor A, but again, I credit instructor A, but instructor C, she seemed to really want to have a discussion, which I thought was great. And we talked about, like, maybe wearing masks, reduces harm to other people, and do other people in my class have a right to be protected from potential harm that I may bring in through some viral pathogen. So we talked about those sorts of things. A couple questions were put to me, and then the instructor started sort of opening it up to the rest of the class, whether people had concerns about this. And then I suggested, like, well, how about I leave the classroom for a few minutes, let the rest of the class discuss because it'd be hard to say, well, I've got a problem with Peter when I'm in the class. So she thought that was a good idea. And so I stepped out of the class, and they talked about, I guess, whatever they talked about. And then after a few minutes, someone came out and invited me back into the classroom. And they told me that, Instructor C told me that they had had a discussion and that everyone is comfortable with me being in the classroom without wearing a mask. And that I was surprised by that. And I mean, I don't want to get Instructor C in trouble, but on some technical level, I guess she violated the edict, but I think she went beyond it and looked at the impact of this edict and tried to weigh, like, have a discussion. I think that's my point. That's what sort of surprised me, and I was pleasantly surprised by this, where she earnestly wanted to have a dialogue. And that was so refreshing. For me, I was not expecting that. And that's something that's been missing in this, is true dialogue. I know there are people in my small classes who have very different views than me, and they're allowed to hold those views. But it was so refreshing to see that. After class, I wanted to talk to Instructor C, and my intent was to thank her. I wanted to sort of let her know that, like, this has been difficult for me. I have been, it's been sort of dark times, frankly. I've had some dark thoughts. I felt despondent. I felt cut off from sort of my community at school, and that she, I've got certain, faith convictions, and our school is ostensibly a religious school, and in my framing, I think that, God really showed up, that the Spirit of God was present in this instructor who wanted to have a dialogue, and that was quite moving. Anyway, I wanted to just sort of thank her, so I thought I would go to her office and spend a few minutes just sort of thanking her for that. And something interesting happened. I got into her office, and I think I can get through this here, but basically I wanted to start off by saying, I have been feeling despondent recently, and this has been an edifying experience for me, one that I wasn't expecting. I didn't get very far into saying those words, and I broke down. Hopefully I won't break down here on the camera. It was like quite emotional, and I realized, I knew this has been a burden. I know it's been a burden on a lot of people, but I don't think I knew just how much, I don't know what you want to call it, grief, hurt, sort of negative feelings that I've been sort of carrying around, and Instructor C's grace in that moment kind of cut into that, and it was, it was a spiritual experience. There's no other way. That's how I frame it. There's no other way for me to really describe it. And it was surprising, because I am not one to break down emotionally. I'm generally not wired that way. I don't think I've been that emotional. In fact, I know I haven't. The last time I was anywhere near that emotional was 20 years ago when my mother died. But so yeah, that was surprising, and it gave me some hope that maybe we can have a discussion. One of the things I said to Instructor C, which was sort of a new thought to me, and one that I want to kind of turn over in my head here a little bit, and that I think I said something to the effect of, I don't know if we choose our convictions. And what I mean by that is it would be so much easier for me to put on the mask and just go along. And but there's something in me, or something that I know to be true or feel is true, that these mandates and these authorities, whether it be school or governmental, asserting its will on the individual freedoms of a person, there's something that doesn't offend me personally so much as it offends humanity somehow. That's how I see it. Now, I'm not saying that if you don't see it that way, that there's something wrong with you. I'm just saying, like, my own convictions, like, it would be easier if I could just get rid of those convictions, and then I could just wear a mask, get a needle, go to school, and go along my merry way. But there's something in me that tells me that this is wrong. And anyway, I don't know that I choose those convictions as much as I discover them somehow. No, I have a faith tradition, and again, it's a little bit like, I'm not sure if you've had this before. It's happened to me where something happens and it just dawns on you. It's like, oh crap, I gotta go do the right thing. And you feel like that you know what you have to do. And I think of one example. I was with the fire department, and I was a public safety officer as well as a suppression firefighter, and I had screwed something up sort of administratively. And it was I won't get into the details, but I kind of opened an email. I was like, oh, I screwed this thing up. And there was something that was a little bit outside of my control that, like, I didn't will this to happen. But it was a little bit of negligence on my part. I should have done a better job checking to make sure that something had happened, and there was like a deadline that got missed, and it's like, this sucks. And I knew right away what I had to do. I had to go to the fire chief and say, I screwed up. This is how I screwed up. This is how I'm culpable, and here's what I'm doing to make sure that it doesn't happen, and I take full responsibility. And it's weird, I had this mixed feeling where there was part of me that knew, like, that's what I have to do, and that would ultimately be freeing somehow. Whether he says that's okay or whether he yells at me, that's sort of beside the point, that I need to kind of own this thing. But there was another part of me that was like, that wanted to sort of like, could I gloss over this? Could I hide this? Could I deflect blame? But there's just part of me that I kind of like knew what I had to do. And I think this conviction about mask mandates and vaccine mandates, there's just something in me that kind of sees that these are wrong. I realize I'm probably going long on time here, but so I had a new thought, and this wasn't something that came up yesterday, but something that I've been thinking about last night and today. And I'm just trying to figure out what it is that's wrong with a university requiring that one wear a face mask. And I think, and I'm still hashing this out, so I'd be curious about your comments. I wonder if, on some level, a face mask is a religious symbol. Now, bear with me here. Part of this is because I'm taking a class with Instructor C that is about worship and ritual in a Christian context. One thing I'm learning in that class is just how important symbolism is in religion, and that everything means something, even if we don't know what that meaning is. And you can, even if you're not religious or if you're not of a particular faith tradition, you can do a simple experiment. Go to a Catholic church service, and actually, if you could, even ideally, go to one that's not in your native language. I know that's maybe hard to do. And just take in the symbolism. And then go to a Protestant church service, again, if you could, ideally in a language that you don't understand, and just take it in. What are people wearing? What does the building look like? How do people sit? When do they stand? Do they stand? Are there pews? What's the mood like? Like, all these things have meaning. And there's theological reasons why those two experiences would be very different. But I think it has a lot to do with the symbolism. And without getting too much into it, what I'm learning is one's theology or one's belief. Theology is just a word for sort of how one sort of views the divine, I guess. But one's theology informs one's symbolism, but then the symbols also kind of reinforce the theology. So it completes the circuit. And even if you're not religious, there are so many symbols in the world. If you look at Parliament, in British Parliament, Canadian Parliament, there's the Speaker of the House. And when they open Parliament, there's a ceremony, and there's a sergeant at arms, and he carries what's called a mace, which it looks fancy, but it's basically a club. It's a bludgeon. It's a weapon. And that is brought in ceremoniously, and it sits like in front of the speaker. And as far as I know, like in the last couple hundred years, I don't know that any Speaker of the House has actually beaten anyone with the mace. But that's sort of what it's meant to symbolize. It's the force of law. It's the authority and the force that comes from the crown, that comes from God. I mean, there's all kinds of things you could say about it. But these symbols are important because they represent things that are abstract. So that's what a symbol is. It's basically a concrete word or form that articulates or points to some kind of abstract idea. You see this if you go to a courthouse, that judges will wear robes, the room will be designed a certain way, the building would be designed a certain way. There's a certain ritual that comes with it. If you're a lawyer or a barrister, paralegal, and you go into a courtroom, I think maybe anyone for that matter, you're meant to bow toward the bench, which is to show deference, to recognize the authority. These things are like imbued in our culture. So is a mask, now some people would say that a mask is a virus spreading mitigation device, for lack of a better word. And now you might have different opinions about whether it even does that, but just for the sake of argument, let's suppose that it is at least meant to be that. How well it does at that, let's just leave that open. But is that all that a mask is? Is it just a medical intervention device, or could it mean more? I think we are so surrounded by symbols, I don't know that we can wear something that's not a symbol at some level. And when I say symbol, it doesn't have to necessarily point to something profound. The clothes we wear are a symbol. They say something about us. You don't know exactly what it says, but I wore this shirt for whatever reason. It says something about what I value, what I don't value, how I feel about myself, how I want to present myself perhaps. There's all kinds of clues that are tied up in these symbols that we use and that we wear. And I think a COVID mask could mean lots of different things. It could, and so in no particular order, it could mean means I respect authority, I comply. It could say I'm going along with this begrudgingly. You see people wearing the mask around their chin or under their nose. I'm not saying that everyone that wears it like that is trying consciously to say that, but it could symbolize I'm doing this under protest. It could communicate I believe that health is an important value. It could say I care about my community. I care about your safety. It could communicate I'm a good person. It could communicate I don't want any trouble. It could communicate I'm scared. It could communicate I believe that science is the ultimate good and that is what can ultimately save us. There's any number of things that it can communicate, but I think it is a symbol. It is something that it can't not be a symbol. Anything that I think we wear necessarily has to be a symbol on some level. And I think it's actually even more than a symbol, I dare say. If a mask was something that we sort of put on our shelf, or that we fly on the top of a flagpole, that would be a certain type of symbol. But when we take a symbol and we actually interact with it with our body, I think it becomes even more than a symbol. It becomes a ritual. I remember I used to work for CBC years ago, and I remember I was being interviewed there before I started working there. They have these security gates, or like a turnstile, where you have a badge, and it was pretty high security, and it had these plexiglass barriers, and it would only let one person in at a time. You had to swipe your badge, and it would open up. You'd go through, and it would close, and the next person would come. Anyway, I was sitting there waiting for the person who was interviewing me to come down, and I was just kind of watching these CBC employees file in. Now, I'm not saying it was designed this way or anything, but something just sort of, I noticed that some people would wear their badge around their neck on a lanyard. And because of where you swipe was kind of low, instead of taking off your lanyard and swiping, by the way, when I worked there, I kept it on my belt just so I wouldn't have to do this. But I noticed there was a procession of people lining up, and because of the lanyard, they would bow down to swipe the lanyard. And it looked like a ritual. There's these people lining up, bowing, and then being allowed in, and the next person would come and bow and come in. And again, I'm not saying the CBC designed it this way, but rituals matter, and I think they get into sort of our being. Again, I have no idea if this is true, but I imagine in the courtroom I talked about, you bow toward the bench to show deference. This is complete conjecture, but I would hazard a guess that the bowing not only symbolizes one's subservience or deference to the bench, it actually makes us believe it and act that way when we physically bow, when we actively participate in that little mini ritual. So, interesting experiment. I don't know that it could ever be done, but I imagine that if you got courtrooms and divided them into two separate groups where everything was identical except for one thing, one where lawyers and witnesses, etc., had to bow, and the other where they didn't, one might expect that over time you might see more raucous or disrespectful behavior in the control group, or is that the experiment group? I don't know. In the group where they don't bow. Again, I'm guessing here, but I suspect that it has some effect on how we behave. So a mask. Wearing a mask is, I think, a ritual. Especially you watch people coming to a building like at University of Waterloo, and you see people take out their masks and put them on as they enter the door. And when you participate with other people, like you are participating in some kind of ritual. And I think maybe this is something that's at the root of why I find these mask mandates offensive, not to me personally, but to, I guess, humanity, to people. Because it seems that our governments, and again, I don't think they intended to do this, but just because one doesn't intend a certain outcome doesn't mean that certain outcomes don't follow from it. In fact, we often don't know what's going to come from our actions. But it seems to me that governments, and in this case a university, is essentially mandating that we participate in a specific ritual. And I find that, again, offensive to the idea that we should be, I want to say free thinkers. But again, in my faith tradition, there's a story in Exodus, a lot of people know it, where Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, "Let my people go." And that's sort of the line that a lot of people know. And then there's these different plagues. But there's a second part of that, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing. But he says, "Let my people go." So my people need to be free. Let my people go in order that we can go out into the desert and serve the Lord or worship the Lord. So it's not that they just want to be free so they can do whatever they want. They're demanding of Pharaoh that they be free so that they can live their lives the way that they believe their God is calling them to do. That God's way of doing things is above and beyond Pharaoh's authority. And we need to have freedom, not so that we can, I don't believe that it's important that we have freedom so we can do whatever we want. It's important that we have freedom so that we can follow whatever it is that we believe is of the highest value. What is the ultimate reality? What is our calling? Whether you call that a religious following, that's sort of my tradition, but maybe you have some other following, but something that you believe transcends the here and now, that I believe that we're created to seek that thing or that person or that being of our own volition, not at the end of a sword, but because we choose to. Christians have gotten this wrong over the ages. We know this, where, in the Middle Ages, you'd have different churches persecuting people for heresy, for wrong belief. And again, coming back to the Anabaptists, they felt strongly that the local magistrate, the local cleric, doesn't get to impose how I choose to worship God or express my devotion to that being. That is something that is not in the realm of the civil authorities. Jesus himself talks about giving to Caesar what is Caesar and giving to God what is God's. I think there is a distinction. There is something that is of a higher spiritual order that transcends earthly authorities. Anyway, perhaps I'll leave it there. Tell me what you think. Are masks a religious symbol? When we wear masks, are we participating in a religious ritual? And I should say, by religion, I mean this in a relatively broad sense. I would call like a religious ritual, or maybe religion, we'll say small r religion, but very broadly, it is one's worldview or / understanding of what constitutes ultimate reality, that or the highest value. So one who believes that there is no God, that, has a materialistic view, I would say that in my definition here, that is a religion in the sense that is what they believe in, that is the ultimate reality, that all there is the material world. So that is a religion, I would argue, in the way I'm using it here. So are masks a religious symbol, and by wearing them, are we participating, perhaps unknowingly, in a religious ritual? And when our authorities require that we wear them, are they requiring that we participate in a religious ritual? Tell me what you think. Thanks for watching.